Welcome back to the ie537 Large-Scale Systems Engineering lecture on risk analysis. I'm Greg Weiss from Sandia Labs, and we've been talking about risk analysis for the last two lectures. I have a very brief lecture here as well as a homework assignment as lecture 3 in this series. We've talked about the definitions of risk analysis and the basic principles and techniques about how risk assessment can be divided into three basic questions. What can happen, how likely is it, and how bad is it? We've also talked about a number of applications and some examples with talking about the different techniques that were domain specific there. Today I'm going to talk about some software applications that can be used for risk assessment, and then we'll talk about the homework assignment. The software that's used for risk assessment can be divided into three basic types. The first is the very simple type. We call it questionnaires more than anything else. They measure how we conform to best practices or avoid common scenarios that engage risk. These may be logic models for a generic facility. They embody the risk insights that are for a generic system. So if you have a questionnaire type risk assessment software, it will go through the best practices in that industry or for that type of a facility and help you measure whether you are conforming to those best practices. It doesn't look at the specifics that may be unique to your system or facility. And some of these types of very simple risk assessment software simply track the responses that you make for, say, a failure modes and effects analysis or a HAZOP analysis. They help you organize that information so that you can present it and try to gain completeness there, but they don't provide much in terms of additional help to ensure completeness. The second type of risk assessment software is logic models. These are really blank slates. You start out with a blank logic model and you put in all of the different knowledge and understanding of the facility. You build the fault tree or the event tree or the influence diagram from scratch to represent the very specific information at your facility or your system. These types of methods, since you're putting in the domain knowledge from the beginning, tend to be very expensive and time-consuming to build. You've got to have a lot of buy-in in the organization when you are using these kinds of models, because you're building in expertise from a variety of different subject matter experts and different domains that are important to this system or facility. As a result, you've got to have a lot of cooperation amongst the various disciplines and buy-in from all of the different parts of the organization to be really successful in building these logic models. Based on the fact that you're having to start from scratch with a blank slate, it can be very difficult to ensure the completeness of these models unless the risk analyst has some familiarity with other risk assessment models that have been done for similar systems or in similar domains. The reasoning through of those of the risks involved in a domain the first time can miss important risk elements. So having familiarity with the domain or with similar systems through risk assessment can help ensure that completeness. The third type of risk assessment software is a simulation engine. Here what you're trying to do is to model the facility or the system in an adequate level of detail and ask what-if kinds of questions to get at what happens for specific scenarios. If we have a deterministic simulation engine, we will try to drive that simulation engine with a wide variety of boundary conditions to explore what happens to the system under a set of specific conditions. So if we have a high consequence asset that we're trying to prevent from being violated in some way, rendered into an unsafe condition, say it's something that we are transporting and must be maintained at a specific temperature. We will use a simulation engine to look at the variety of different types of vehicle accidents that might occur to see if one of those accidents might cause the asset to become into a condition that would be unsafe. It may be that the packaging material gets violated in some way that we hadn't expected. So we will drive that simulation engine using as many sets of boundary conditions as possible to explore that space. Alternatively, if we have a system that is composed of parts that exhibit stochastic behavior, randomness, we will build that randomness into a model and execute it a large number of times to understand how that randomness can cause the system to move into conditions that we hadn't expected. So we will just run the simulation engine multiple times using these random variables to drive us to different sets of outcomes. We'll then look at what caused those different outcomes to occur and base our risk assessment on those results. Let's take a look at some of the types of software that are available in each of these categories. For the simple end here, there are a lot of different software tools that are available, most of which are very domain specific. So if you have a system that you're performing a risk assessment for, look in the industry literature to understand whether or not such a risk assessment software tool already exists. Alternatively, look to understand what the best practices are in that industry or in that domain, and use those best practices as a checklist as a method to understand the risks of your system. For failure modes and effects analysis, HAZOP and similar kinds of simple inductive reasoning tools, there are software packages that basically keep track of your responses and help you organize that information, because there is a lot of information that has to be kept together and organized in order to ensure that the completeness of the analysis actually occurs, that you've gone through all the different system states in the HAZOP, or that you've looked at all of the different components in the failure modes and effects analysis. So these simple logic model tools help you by keeping track of that data and asking you questions to ensure that you've gone through systematically. There are also different models and methods that are kind of a hybrid between the questionnaire model and the logic models. The Sandia's risk assessment methodologies, which are available for things like electric power distribution systems, dams, water utilities, chemical facilities, and so forth, combine the questionnaire approach of what are common risks with the hybrid with the logic approach that's built into the fault tree analysis and event tree analysis methods that we'll describe later. So it's not quite a clean distinction among these methods, but the methodology, there are hybrid methodologies available. In terms of building logic models, there are a large variety of software tools available out there. For the workhorse methods of fault tree and event tree analysis, I've listed some of them here. There are some that are proprietary, some that are even open source, so you can look and see what's used in your domain to choose a software product that meets your needs. Didn't talk much about Markov modeling. It's a tool that also fits into the logic model method. It's a state-based modeling methodology that is commonly used in relatively simple state-based systems. There are tools that will do that as well. Influence diagrams are not used as commonly, but you can see that there are several tools there to help you create influence diagrams. Bayesian belief networks are a probabilistic representation of influence diagrams that allow you to insert known probabilities into unknown networks of influence diagrams and infer what some of the other probabilities in that network may be. So they're a very specialized statistical tool related to influence diagrams, and there are several tools that are available to help solve those. The key here is not the tools, it's to make sure that you use a method that is appropriate to the problem at hand, that helps you answer those three questions in a way that will be complete and that will allow you to communicate those results to the decision makers. Finally, in terms of simulation software, there's also a wide variety of tools available. For stochastic discrete event simulation or agent-based simulation, there are a lot of tools available. Most of them are tailored to a specific domain. So I've listed some of them here. There are many, many more available. Look at what's used in a particular domain already, because you may be able to pick up some existing models that will help you as you go through the risk assessment for a particular problem. These are driven by the random behavior that's embedded in the models, so you don't need to drive them with a separate uncertainty engine. Deterministic simulation tools are available in many domains. I've listed just a few of them here, but the objective of these tools is to allow you to do a deterministic simulation of a system that appears to be deterministic, whether that be a nuclear power plant accident, which we might model with Melcor or TRAC, whether that be structural simulation for a building or an impact that might be done with Pronto, Abacus, or Dyna. Maybe it's a fluid flow problem where we would use EPA-NET. Maybe it's more general and you would use something like PowerSim, Dynamo, and so forth. The point here is that these are deterministic tools. You put in a set of boundary conditions, run it through the system, the simulation, and you get an answer out the end. In order to make use of this in a risk assessment paradigm, you need to vary the boundary conditions and the characteristics within the model to ensure that you have a full understanding of the possible set of outcomes that may occur. We can do that either deterministically using a design of experiments, so we construct all of the different options for boundary conditions and systematically run them through the tools, or we can do that using a stochastic method. So we would describe probability distributions for those boundary conditions, then use an uncertainty engine such as Crystal Ball, At-Risk, or LHS to develop a set of inputs that would be used sequentially with the deterministic solution software. So something like Crystal Ball would put out maybe 100 or maybe 1,000 different sets of boundary conditions that would be used to evaluate that would be used for evaluation in the deterministic simulation software. We could then come up with a statistical representation of the likelihood of particular bad outcomes occurring based on the results that come out of the deterministic simulation software, driven by the random uncertainty. I'd like to talk about some caveats now for risk assessment software. The tendency is to think of risk assessment software as a black box. If I use the risk assessment software, answer the questions, I'm going to have a complete risk assessment coming out the back end. There is no software that can replace the risk analyst. It's the discipline and curiosity and expertise of the risk analyst that provides a valid risk assessment. Risk analysis is a process. It's a mindset for disciplined investigation. And just as I've said previously that there is no cookbook for doing risk analysis, that applies equally to paper or to software. So we need to be curious, use the risk assessment software and risk assessment methods to help us. They're like crutches to help us get through the analysis, but the key is the disciplined investigation and curiosity of the risk analyst for understanding the system, the consequences, the scenarios, and the likelihoods to come up with a valid risk assessment. So software and methods help us give structure and help the curious analyst to ask the right questions and organize their insights. So they are helpful, but they aren't the end in themselves. They help us enforce the discipline. They help us ask the questions, and they push us toward analytical completeness. But they can also give us a false sense of security, because the causes of risk are very location and system specific. If we start out with the checklist kind of or questionnaire kind of software and follow it through to the end, we can have the false sense that we have now explored the entire risk space for a system. But we haven't yet looked at maybe the details of our particular system or our particular location that might contribute to risk in new and unique ways. So we need to understand what's unique about our system, about our facility, and how does that impact risk, not just the generic facilities or systems that were used in the process of developing the questionnaire. The details are often critical in risk analysis. Very rarely do we develop a system where there's a flaw in the top level design of the system. Usually the top level is something that we can design well and be complete and have and believe that we have very little risk in, as long as the details are developed properly. What usually happens then is that the different pieces of that high-level design are then taken out to different design teams who will do the detailed design. And what often happens is that some little detail over in one aspect of the analysis will conflict with the assumptions that's made for some little detail over in a different aspect of the analysis. And these will combine in a way that causes a vulnerability that wasn't expected. What ends up happening then is that the boundaries between these were not set up well, and that allows a vulnerability to occur. This is a fundamental characteristic of systems kinds of problems that we have to recognize, and that's why the details are very critical in a risk analysis. If we stop at the top level when doing a risk analysis, we will likely have a very incomplete picture of risk, and we need to, and it will be of very little value to the decision maker. So, as a result, if we build software, if we use software, it's garbage in, garbage out. If we aren't curious and disciplined in our method for going through, looking at the details of the risk analysis, we will have an incomplete assessment. And a poorly executed risk analysis can be done just as easily using software as it can be using pen and paper. Poorly executed generally means that you're leaving out a scenario or leaving out a consequence in your analysis. And if we've left it out, there's not a systematic way or an obvious way to understand what's been left out often. And we go on making decisions without the benefit of understanding the system fully. So my plea as we talk about software here is don't blindly use risk assessment software. Think for yourself. The analyst is the most important part of the risk assessment process. Be curious, be disciplined as you look at the answers to the three questions of what can happen, how likely is it, and how bad can it be. Let's move now into the homework problem. So your homework assignment here, I expect will take probably about 2 hours to complete. There are 3 questions here. The first one involves developing a complementary cumulative distribution function. I've assigned this problem because this is a very effective way to communicate risk to decision makers, so I want you to know how to develop and to interpret a complementary cumulative distribution function. I have gone through and gathered some statistics on automobile vehicle accidents. What I want, and they're on the following slide, I want you to first of all construct a CCDF for this data. I want it to be on a logarithmic scale because the likelihoods vary by orders of magnitude, and this is common for data in risk assessments. I've put a reference to where I talked about CCDFs in the lecture. Use the data then to give me three pieces of information: the expected likelihood of a payout of at least $1 million, and the likelihood that during the life of an automobile, if it were 100,000 miles, what's the likelihood what's the consequence that would be exceeded for no more than 1 in 100 cars during their lifetimes. And then also the loss expectancy per 100,000 vehicle miles, and that's just the sum of the probability times consequence. So that's a loss expectancy. It's similar to the annual loss expectancy, except this is based on probabilities instead of frequencies. We don't have years built into this calculation. Here's the data, and I've included an Excel spreadsheet file that contains this data already. This is based on 2005 auto crash statistics, but the consequences are completely fictional. I didn't have access to any data like that. And there's a note here about setting up your CCDF that will allow you to plot it on the log scale. So that's the first problem. Second homework problem, let's go back to the neo-Luddite group that Dennis has been describing for you and having you work problems with in previous lectures. I would like you to visualize yourself as the leader of this neo-Luddite group. You're planning several potential explosives operations, and I want you to perform a risk assessment from the perspective of the leader of this neo-Luddite group. So what are the consequences that would be of concern to you as the leader of this group, including day-to-day operations, some explosives operations, looking at the different types of consequences that may occur. Now, for each of these pieces here, I'm not looking for a long answer. I'm looking for maybe for a bullet list or a sentence or a phrase. I want you to understand the development of the consequences, enumeration of them, and why it is that that the leader of this group would be concerned about particular consequences and not others. Then for each of the consequences, I'd like you to identify a few scenarios, 2 or 3 scenarios related to that consequence. I'm hoping that by the time you finish this question, you'll have on the order of 10 to 15 scenarios written out, and not in detail, but here as a bullet list again, and considering each of the types of scenarios that I've listed here. So internal and external random events. External random events can be things like weather events, things that are external to your group. So whether it's weather or things happening that are imposed on your group from the outside. But also think of a malevolent outsider, and in this case, the malevolent outsider for you may be law enforcement. A malevolent insider, a member of your group, and think of cyber events that may also lead to some of these consequences. I'd like you to assign verbal descriptions to the likelihood of each scenario. I'm not looking for a detailed justification, but just to develop a scale and so for those likelihoods and assign a likelihood to each one. And then again, a verbal description for the consequence magnitude for at least 2 consequence metrics. Again, I'm not looking for detailed justification here, but go through the list of scenarios and develop what likelihoods and consequences for each of these, say, 10 to 15 scenarios. Then display the results for all the scenarios for one of the consequences on a scatter plot. This was the color chart that I put up where we put dots on it to represent various scenarios, and looking at likelihood versus consequence for scenarios. Then just pick one high-risk scenario from the scatter plot and write about it, a paragraph or 2, and list a couple of low-risk scenarios from the scatter plot to indicate where we may not want to do anything. Risk acceptance might be appropriate. So that's problem 2. Problem 3 builds on this same example, but from a different perspective. Here we move to the law enforcement perspective. And so we're going to look at the risk assessment we just did for this neo-Luddite group, and we're going to see how we might exploit the things that the neo-Luddites consider as risks as part of our enforcement activities. So I'd like you to look at the policy categories that Dennis has provided you earlier and think about which ones of those policy considerations would be effective, which ones would be ineffective in countering and reducing the threat posed by the neo-Luddites. Then we need to look at a few possible ways to exploit some of their higher risk scenarios. So look back at the higher risk scenarios that you identified in the second problem, pick a couple of them, and look at them to see how we might exploit them. Look at the potential consequences to society, develop a couple of scenarios, and we're going to do a brief project risk assessment on this. So as part of that project risk assessment, look at one of their high-risk scenarios, identify at least 3 potential consequences to society if we were to go through and try to exploit that risk to reduce the threat posed by the neo-Luddites. So look at consequences to society, generate some contingencies for trying to implement this project. So things that might go wrong as we try to implement this scenario to blunt the threat caused by the neo-Luddites. And again, likelihood and severity of consequences, and just a sentence or two stating whether you believe that this would be a prudent action, plan of action to pursue against the neo-Luddites. I expect that this is probably a couple-hour kind of homework assignment. If you're getting into too much detail on it, it may take longer than that, so I kind of guide your thinking on the amount of detail you're getting into based on time. I've really appreciated this opportunity to talk to you. I've enjoyed doing risk assessment for many years. It's a very valuable tool, and I hope that you're able to apply it successfully as part of your system of systems engineering.